He walked into that courtroom alone. No lawyer, no entourage, just a quiet black man in a wrinkled suit. They thought he was just another nobody with a chip on his shoulder, another name to check off the docket. But what they didn't know was that the man they mocked, the one they dragged in without cause, wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to investigate them. By the time he laid his FBI badge on the judge's bench, the laughter died, the air changed, and every uniform in the room realized they weren't the ones holding power anymore. This isn't just a story about mistaken identity. It's about how truth moves in silence, how systems crack under their own weight, and how one man turned a routine arrest into a federal reckoning. If that moment made you pause, don't scroll past it, share it with someone who knows silence doesn't mean surrender, and subscribe to MrDodd. Because what comes next? It isn't noise. It's change. The bailiff barely glanced up when he called the name Leonard Briggs. A murmur passed through the room, not curiosity, just the routine churn of judgment, like they already knew how the next 5 minutes would go. In the back, 2 officers leaned closer, trading smirks like middle school bullies. "That him?" one whispered. "Gotta be. Looks like one of those sovereign citizen types, gotta argue the Constitution like it's a coupon book." They chuckled loud enough to turn a few heads. Leonard didn't flinch. He stood from the last bench with no urgency, no fear, just quiet precision. No one moved to stop him because no one saw him as a threat. Just a man in a cheap suit, walking toward humiliation, or so they thought. He didn't carry a folder, didn't flash papers, didn't even make eye contact. He was too still, too calm, like he'd been here before. The judge, an older white man with a thinning comb-overs and a voice like it belonged on AM radio, adjusted his glasses and squinted at the file. "Mr. Briggs, you're being charged with failure to comply during a lawful stop, is that correct?" Leonard's answer was soft, but certain. "That's what the report says." The room shifted, just slightly. One of the officers muttered, "No lawyer?" The judge raised his eyebrows. "You don't have counsel with you?" Leonard didn't break stride. "I don't need one." That drew a snort from the back. "Of course not," the officer said under his breath. "He's going to tell us he knows his rights better than the law." But Leonard wasn't there for theatrics. He didn't pace, he didn't argue, he didn't perform. He stood in silence so thick it started choking the noise around him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Leonard took one small step forward, and the mood snapped. He reached into his coat, and one officer in the gallery jerked upright, hands sliding toward his holster, the courtroom crackling with assumptions. Leonard moved slowly, not flinching, not reacting to the sudden tension, and pulled out a small laminated badge. He didn't hold it up for show. He didn't announce it like a movie reveal. He just walked up and set it on the judge's bench with the calm precision of someone who had waited for this exact moment. "I'm Leonard D. Briggs, Director of Internal Affairs, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The room didn't gasp. It stopped, like gravity had just shifted and no one was sure how to walk again. The badge sat there, quiet but loud, a truth no one had prepared for. The judge leaned in slightly, stunned. "You're with the FBI?" Leonard nodded once. "I oversee misconduct investigations across the southeastern region, including departments flagged for irregular stops and missing body cam footage." Behind him, the officers who had been laughing now looked like they'd swallowed broken glass. The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again, fumbling for composure. "Would you mind stepping into my chambers?" he offered weakly. Leonard's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "No, Your Honor. I prefer to stay right here, on record." And just like that, the courtroom turned in on itself. The same people who had been ready to dismiss him now didn't know where to look. Their silence wasn't just awkward. It was accountability beginning to breathe. Because Leonard didn't come to play the part they wrote for him, he came to rewrite the script entirely. It was just after 10:30 at night when Leonard pulled off Highway 45, the hume of the road still clinging to the silence inside his silver Toyota Camry. It was the kind of car that didn't ask for attention. No tinted windows, no government plates, no bells, no whistles. Just steel, rubber, and a man trying to disappear into the night. He had spent the day visiting small departments across the Gulf, checking compliance records, following up on flagged behavior, departments that smiled in daylight and turned off cameras after sunset. His destination was a roadside motel on Bayou View Drive. Nothing fancy, just a place to close the laptop and lay his head. But before he could even reach the exit, red and blue lights lit up behind him like a warning shot across a quiet life. He didn't panic. He didn't speak. He just pulled over with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing how fast a regular moment can become irreversible. Two white officers stepped out of the cruiser with a pace that didn't match the calm of the night. One had a shaved head and a flashlight already in hand. The other walked stiffly, scanning the car like it was preloaded with a crime. Before Leonard could reach for the glove box, the bald one knocked hard on the driver's side window, twice. Not a tap, a command. "License and registration," he barked. Leonard lowered the window halfway and asked the simplest, most lawful question. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" The officer's eyes narrowed like he'd been insulted. "You didn't signal on that last lane change," he replied, voice tightening. Leonard nodded, slowly. "I believe I did." That response alone was enough to shift the temperature. The second officer appeared on the passenger side, leaned toward the glass and growled, "You got something to hide?" Leonard turned his head calmly. "No, but I would like to know if this is a traffic stop or an interrogation." That question didn't break the silence. It broke the mask. "Step out of the vehicle," barked the bald officer, reaching for his belt. Leonard didn't move. "I haven't refused anything. I asked a question." And that was the exact moment calm turned criminal in their eyes. They didn't wait for justification. The passenger door was ripped open, Leonard's seatbelt unclicked by hands that didn't care about consent. They pulled him out with no warning, no explanation, no restraint. He didn't yell, he didn't fight, but they still slammed him onto the asphalt like he'd made a move, like they were wrestling a weapon, not a man. One knee in his back, the other officer gripping his wrist at an angle, meant to punish, not secure. The gravel dug into his cheek as one muttered, refusing to comply, while the other reported, "Subject is non-responsive, possibly combative." Leonard heard it all. Every word, every lie layered over silence, because to them he wasn't Leonard Briggs. He wasn't internal affairs. He was just a silhouette that talked too calmly and asked too many questions. They didn't see a badge. They saw a man with no mouth, no story, no weight, and they treated him exactly like that. But Leonard wasn't helpless. He wasn't naive. He was deliberate. The moment those lights came on behind him, he had quietly activated the slim recorder sewn into the inner lining of his coat. It was habit, not paranoia. Experience taught him that when things unravel fast, truth doesn't survive by chance, it survives by design. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He documented. Not because he wanted to catch them. Truth, he would later say, doesn't need permission to be remembered. It just needs a place to hide until it's safe to speak. And on that dark Mississippi road, the truth sat quietly in his pocket, waiting for someone to ask the right question. When they dragged him into the station, they didn't ask questions. They made declarations. Refused to cooperate. Possible federal impersonation, vague on destination, none of it true, all of it filed. He was placed in a holding cell with no phone call, no contact, no camera visible. When he asked for the arresting officer's badge number, the response was a cold stare and a comment designed to sting. "Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to ask questions in court." Hours passed. No one offered water, no one checked paperwork, no one turned on a body cam, because that night there weren't any working. And no one seemed to notice. The walls of that station didn't echo with guilt. They echoed with certainty, the kind of certainty that believes power is permanent and silence is consent. But Leonard knew better, and as he sat alone in that echo chamber of indifference, he wasn't waiting for rescue. He was waiting for exposure. Now, let me ask you, how many stories like this don't have a recorder running? How many men and women sit in cells not because they broke the law, but because they didn't play the part expected of them? If Leonard Briggs hadn't been who he was, If he hadn't known the law inside and out, if he hadn't pressed record, how would this have ended? Would we ever hear his name? Or would he be just another line in a forgotten file marked unfounded? If that makes you clench your jaw, don't sit on it. Tap like. Share this story with someone who believes truth shouldn't require a title to be protected. And subscribe to MrDodd, because what comes next, it's not just evidence. It's justice. Long overdue. The courtroom emptied in stiff silence. No one dared look Leonard in the eye, not after that badge changed everything. Behind closed doors, voices dropped to whispers. The same judge who had barely looked up now sat with his hands shaking slightly under the bench, mumbling to his clerk about press fallout and official channels. The officers who once chuckled from the back now leaned into a corner like they could disappear into drywall. They didn't see a man anymore. They saw a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They reflect what you've ignored. Leonard hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened. He had only laid the truth on the table, and somehow that rattled the system more than a raised fist ever could. Because when power finds itself face-to-face with someone it can't control, the fear doesn't roar. It whispers. Down the hallway, two people were already moving. Tamara Wells, a department analyst known for keeping her head down and her files neat, found herself flipping open reports she hadn't dared touch in months. She'd read the arrest summary. It felt wrong the moment she saw it. Too vague, too convenient, too clean. Now it was radioactive. Next door, Brian, an IT technician most people forgot existed, had just gotten a quiet message through the internal system. Check the logs for the Briggs arrest May 14th. See who touched them. He didn't ask who sent it. He didn't want to know. But he felt something shift in his stomach as he pulled up the access records. Not because he expected to find nothing, but because part of him already knew he would. The first flag was small, a simple login under Officer Curtis Dell's credentials 2 hours after the arrest. Then another one the next morning, time-stamped just before the camera logs vanished from the archive. Brian squinted at the screen. Dell had bypassed the audit trail, deleted 2 entries, and marked the folder as system error. It wasn't slick, it was sloppy, but it was dangerous. Brian printed the log, slid it into a manila envelope, and didn't email a thing. Some truths, he thought, don't survive the internet. He walked it across the hall himself and dropped it on Tamara's desk. She looked up, confused. Then she saw the name. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Brian just nodded once and walked away. He didn't want credit. He wanted distance. But inside both of them, something had turned. Complicity was no longer neutral. It was radioactive. Leonard came back the next morning. Same suit, same silence, but this time he didn't wait to be invited. He walked through the station like he belonged to the building. Because in a way, he did. The front desk officer stammered when he saw him. "Agent Briggs, we didn't know you were—" Leonard cut him off gently. "I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here to confirm patterns." And that was exactly what he did. With Tamara at his side and the evidence log in his hand, he walked into the operations wing and placed it on the sheriff's desk without a single raised voice. "Someone deleted the camera logs manually," he said, "before the arraignment, after the arrest. You want to take a guess who?" The sheriff rubbed his eyes like he hadn't slept because he hadn't. "We're looking into it," he muttered. Leonard shook his head. "No, you're not. I am." Then he turned and walked out. Not to threaten, not to brag, just to move the spotlight where it needed to go. Back at the motel, Leonard opened his laptop and pulled up a folder that had no title, just a timestamp. Inside it, 32 names, each with a date, a location, and a question mark next to the word resolved. Each one connected to a department with more excuses than answers. Each one flagged not by emotion, but by patterns. The kind of patterns you don't see when you look at a moment. You see them when you study a decade. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He typed. Because for Leonard, this wasn't about one stop, one night, one badge. It was about rot. And how quietly it spreads when no one speaks its name. Now ask yourself, how many times does the system call something a glitch when it's actually a habit? How many good people go home with suspicion on their backs and no badge to drop on the table? This isn't about being shocked. It's about being awake. Because corruption doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a routine. And if you're tired of silence being mistaken for peace, it's time to act. Tap like if this story shook something in you, share it with someone who thinks small acts don't matter, and subscribe to MrDodd, because what we're exposing next, it's not just misconduct, it's culture. And we're not done yet. By Wednesday morning, 2 black SUVs pulled into the rear lot of the Jefferson County Police Department. No sirens, no drama, just a presence so quiet it made noise in people's heads. Grace Mendoza stepped out first, sharp suit, sharper eyes, followed by Nathan Cole, a digital forensics specialist who spoke like a man with nowhere to be but exactly where he was. They weren't here to make a scene. They were here to turn one inside out. Officers behind glass watched them like ghosts, unsure whether to stand, salute, or just disappear. Leonard met them at the door, nodded once, and led them inside. Nobody said welcome. Nobody said anything. The silence was so heavy it could have cracked the floor. Tamara was already in the back office when Grace entered. The files were spread out like a battlefield. Complaints, use of force reports, internal memos, all left to rot until someone finally cared enough to connect the bruises to a pattern. Grace didn't speak. She just picked up one folder, then another and another. Each one had a different name, but read like déjà vu. Tamara looked up. "Every file," she said, "has the same bruise, just a different name." Grace nodded, pulled a sticky note from her jacket, and wrote the word "reopen" in red. Meanwhile, Nathan disappeared into the server room with Brian, the IT tech who had once preferred to be invisible. Not anymore. He handed over access codes without hesitation. He didn't want to be part of the silence anymore. In less than 2 hours, Nathan had the deleted logs recovered, the error tags reversed, and the video folders rebuilt from fragments the system thought had been wiped clean. One clip, only a minute long, nearly collapsed the room when it played. A patrol car mic. No video, just voices. "Where are you headed?" "Can't say." "You can't or you won't." "Federal protocol." The moment the last word echoed through the speakers, Brian's jaw tightened. Tamara froze. Grace stood completely still. Nathan simply looked over at Leonard and said, "Got what we need." Because that phrase wasn't just evidence. It was the ghost of the truth Leonard had spoken in the courtroom, now immortalized in code. The kind of match between story and proof that made every denial look like a lie carved in stone. Sheriff Ricky Hulburn sat behind his desk, jaw tight, watching the walls close in. Grace walked in, placed the printed logs on the table, and said nothing. Ricky stared at the papers, then looked up at Leonard, who was still silent. "I didn't know," Ricky muttered. Leonard didn't flinch. "You didn't ask." Ricky's voice cracked, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of finally seeing how far he'd let his own house rot. "I didn't ask," he repeated, more to himself than anyone. He rubbed his temples. "I've been doing this job 31 years. Somewhere along the way, I stopped looking too hard." Leonard nodded once. "That's how it starts." Ricky didn't resist the audit. He didn't beg. He just leaned back in his chair, a man not broken, but finally willing to admit that maybe he should have been paying attention sooner, because guilt isn't always loud. Sometimes it just sits in your chest, waiting for someone to ask the question you've been too afraid to say out loud. The order came next. Leonard stood in the center of the operations floor, surrounded by the hum of dead printers, locked drawers, and officers who suddenly found the tops of their shoes fascinating. "Effective immediately," he said. "This department is under federal compliance hold. No field operations, dispatch only. All patrols suspended pending review." Someone gasped. No one spoke. Grace began collecting body cam devices, handing each one a numbered envelope. Nathan sealed server access and began cloning drives. Tamara delivered reassignments. Leonard, he just watched. Not with triumph, with gravity. "You don't fix a cracked windshield," he said, "by keeping it on the road." One officer asked quietly, "How long?" Leonard looked at him, not with spite, but clarity. "Until the road's safe again. For everyone." If you've ever wondered what real accountability looks like, it's not loud, it's not fast, and it doesn't come with a bow. It looks like a room full of people who thought they'd never be questioned, now being read back their own silences. It looks like one man in a wrinkled suit holding a department's weight with just a folder and the facts. If that image lit something inside you, don't let it fade. Tap like, share this story with someone who believes change only happens when we show up, and subscribe to Mr. Dodd, because in the next chapter, justice doesn't just knock, it walks through the front door. By Friday morning, the town couldn't look away. The leaked patrol mic recording was everywhere. Phone screens, gas station TVs, kitchen radios, federal protocol. That one phrase, spoken calmly by Leonard Briggs, now echoed louder than any siren ever had. Local news anchors spoke in careful tones, trying not to show how stunned they were. A man arrested for not signaling, now confirmed, FBI. Justice had a name now. So did the silence. And in barbershops, over kitchen tables, in late-night texts between people who thought they were alone in their memories, something cracked open. The community wasn't just watching the news, they were seeing themselves. In the West End barbershop, 5 old men sat with coffee mugs that had seen more years than most badges. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. "They thought he was just another one," one said. "Dragged him out like he was a thief." Another leaned forward. "He didn't fight, he didn't yell, he just was." Across town, inside Bethel Baptist Church, women clutched tissues as their pastor played the audio clip through the sanctuary speakers. Parents sat their kids down after school and said, "This is why we tell you not to talk back, not to reach too fast, not to ask why." Respect, it turns out, isn't taught in schools, it's demanded by survival. The silence that used to protect the ones in power was now flooding with stories, and none of them felt safe keeping quiet anymore. That night, the town hall wasn't just full, it was overflowing. People stood in the back, leaned against walls, crowded the windows. There was no official agenda, just an open mic, a room of bruised voices, and a clock that wouldn't move fast enough. The first to speak was a teenage boy, barely 17, who had been stopped walking home from football practice, twice, in 1 week. They said I fit a description. I was wearing cleats. A mother stepped up next, eyes wet but voice steady. I had my baby in the back seat. He cried the whole time they searched my trunk. They never said what they were looking for. Then an older man, gray beard, slow steps. He hadn't planned to talk, but something about the room made him do it. In '89, I was pulled over and handcuffed. They let me go with no words. I didn't tell nobody. What would have been the point? Leonard stood at the back of the room, arms crossed. He didn't speak. He listened. Because these weren't just stories. They were scars. Then Sheriff Ricky Halburn walked up to the microphone. You could feel the tension tighten like a pulled wire. His uniform looked heavier that night. He cleared his throat once. "I've been in law enforcement for 31 years, and tonight, I'm not proud of that." A hush spread like a slow tide. "We didn't know who Mr. Briggs was," he continued, "but that's not the problem. The problem is, we didn't care who any of you were. We made assumptions. We let shortcuts become habits. We let habits become policies, and some of us sat quiet while the damage spread." He paused, looked toward Leonard. "That's on me." From the back, someone muttered, "Talk is cheap." Ricky nodded, lips pressed. "Then hold me to it." And for the first time in a long time, no one walked out. But just as the room started to shift from pain to power, someone turned toward the mayor. A woman. Felicia Green, whose son had filed a complaint 2 years earlier that never went anywhere, stood with fire in her voice. "Are you going to reopen the old cases?" The mayor adjusted his glasses. "We're looking into that." "No," she snapped. "Don't look, act." Applause broke out. Not thunderous, but real. And right there, in the middle of that small-town auditorium, the pressure flipped. It was no longer on the victims to prove they mattered. It was on the leaders to prove they finally believed it. Leonard didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He saw it in the eyes of people who once sat silent, now standing tall. Something had shifted. But would it hold? If you've ever felt like your story didn't matter, if you've ever wondered why people like Leonard show up with calm voices and bulletproof truth, it's because moments like this only happen when silence is interrupted. You weren't just watching a story tonight. You were part of a reckoning. If that stirred something in you, don't walk away from it. Tap like. Share this with someone who thinks change is impossible. And subscribe to MrDodd, because next time we won't just hear the truth, we'll watch it transform everything in its path. Monday morning, Leonard walked up the steps of City Hall with a folder in one hand and a small coffee in the other. He wasn't rushed, but there was weight in every step. Inside, the mayor waited, nervous, surrounded not by aides or cameras, but by three people who knew exactly why they were there. Grace Mendoza, Tamara Wells, and the man who started it all by staying silent until silence couldn't survive him. No greetings, just Leonard placing the folder on the table like a final stone on a grave. Inside, 5 confirmed policy violations, 3 counts of falsified reporting, 2 body cam tampering incidents, and 1 active attempt to obstruct a federal investigation. No theories, no what-ifs, just facts. This is the part no one claps for, Grace said softly. This is where people stop watching. But this is the work. The mayor swallowed hard and asked, "Are you recommending prosecution?" Leonard didn't blink. "We're recommending a full audit and the immediate removal of Officer Curtis Dell." Silence followed, not from resistance, but because no one could deny what was printed in black and white. Later that day, Officer Dell was called into Sheriff Ricky Halburn's office. No cameras, no press, just a single sheet of paper signed by the mayor and placed face down on the desk. Ricky didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Effective immediately," he said. Dell looked at the letter, then at the window. "That's it?" he asked, voice brittle. Ricky nodded. "You think it shouldn't be?" Dell shook his head slowly, the badge on his chest suddenly heavier than it had ever been. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he muttered. "You didn't care if it was," Ricky replied, "and that's what did you in." Dell stood, didn't argue, didn't plead. He just walked out the back door, silent. The uniform came off, the damage didn't. And in that quiet hallway where power had once moved unchecked, it was clear that the exit mattered more than the entrance ever had. Change didn't come with balloons, it came with binders. Tamara led the implementation team. New training modules were rolled out for use of force and de-escalation. Grace handled the new policy requiring monthly camera audits and random footage reviews. No warning, no wiggle room. A community liaison was hired to track complaint responses, and for the first time in department history, a citizen review panel was formed. There were no banners, no parades, just protocols. Leonard sat in on the first oversight meeting, not to lead it, but to make sure it didn't fizzle into symbolism. "Justice isn't noise," he said. "It's follow-through." And the room understood. This wasn't about looking good, it was about being better. Because every single form that got signed now had to answer one simple question. If this happened again, would we catch it? That evening, Leonard took a walk through the square. He passed the diner, the courthouse, the corner where the town had once gossiped about that FBI guy like he was a storm that passed through. Now people just nodded, some with gratitude, some with discomfort, but none with the smirking dismissal that had once followed him like a shadow. At the end of the block, a teenage boy in a blue hoodie leaned against a lamppost, eyes fixed on his phone. He looked up for a second, saw Leonard, and gave a small nod. Not of fear, not of awe, but of recognition. Leonard returned it with a quiet lift of his chin. That was enough. No handshake, no speech, just acknowledgement between two people who understood that not all respect is taught. Some is earned in the silence after the noise fades. So here's what you take from this. Leonard didn't walk into that courtroom to prove power. He walked in to show what it means to carry responsibility. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about what you leave behind when the title fades, when the uniform's gone, and all that's left is the echo of what you stood for. Because kindness doesn't always look gentle. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like policy change. Sometimes it looks like a quiet man walking away after holding an entire system to account, with nothing but truth and timing. If this story gave you something, clarity, hope, rage, peace, don't let it sit silent. Tap like, share it with someone who still believes one voice can shift a room. And subscribe to MrDodd, because these stories aren't just reminders, they're instructions. And the next one? You won't want to miss what comes next.